Darius Kane. The most powerful crime boss in Baltimore's underworld walked into one of his own diners wearing a worn-out jacket, posing as a tired truck driver, just to find out why this location kept losing money and why its workers were quitting one after another. But instead of the lazy staff he'd expected, his cold gray eyes landed on a thin night shift waitress with hastily tied auburn hair and green eyes shadowed from too little sleep, quietly pushing herself to serve 8 tables at once without a single complaint. Her name was Maeve, 26 years old, and he noticed she kept slipping away. Darius Kane, the most powerful crime boss in Baltimore's underworld, walked into one of his own diners wearing a worn-out jacket, posing as a tired truck driver, just to find out why this location kept losing money and why its workers were quitting one after another. But instead of the lazy staff he'd expected, his cold gray eyes landed on a thin night shift waitress with hastily tied auburn hair and green eyes shadowed from too little sleep, quietly pushing herself to serve 8 tables at once without a single complaint. Her name was Maeve, 26 years old, and he noticed she kept slipping away into the storage room every few minutes, returning with red-rimmed eyes she'd hurry to hide behind a professional smile. Moments later, he watched the heavyset manager storm into the crowded dining room, shout her name, and fire her on the spot after revealing she'd been hiding her frail little sister in the storage room, because she had no one else in the world to turn to. When he saw the young woman carry her pale little sister out into the pouring October rain, no umbrella, no car, something in his chest he'd thought had died long ago suddenly stirred awake. Because 20 years earlier he'd been a soaked, hungry, cast-out boy just like that, until one single person chose to bet on him. And as he began to uncover the heartbreaking truth about her life, this man who was used to ruling through fear realized that what he did next might not only change her fate, but redeem whatever was left of his own humanity. Before we begin, please remember that while the story you're about to hear is fiction, the message behind it is very real, because sometimes kindness comes from the place we least expect. If this story touches your heart, tap that like button so we know you're here. Don't forget to share it with someone who might need a little hope today. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next healing story. The sound was not loud, only the noise of a stack of cardboard boxes slipping from a shelf and spilling onto the storeroom floor. But in that moment between shifts, when the clink of knives and forks and the sound of laughter had just faded, it rang out with painful clarity, like a confession. Behind the sliding door that led into the storage area, a tiny hand had just reached for a blue-colored pencil that had rolled too far away, and the whole corner shelf stacked with napkins had swayed with it. 9-year-old Brianni sat curled on an overturned plastic crate, an old sketchbook open on her lap, her pale little face lifting with the frightened look of a child who knew she had just done something she was not supposed to do. Maeve was carrying a tray of coffee to table number 4 when she froze, her whole body going rigid for 1 second. Then she hurriedly set the tray down and rushed toward the back with steps she tried to keep as quiet as possible. But it was already too late. A middle-aged customer sitting near the storeroom entrance turned his head in curiosity, then let out a small cry when he saw the child's tiny figure through the half-open door. Whispers spread like ripples, and from the accounting room at the end of the hallway, the door flew open with a heavy bang. Frank Petrosky stepped out, his swollen belly shaking with every heavy step, his greasy sweat-slick face already flushed red, even before he fully understood what was happening. Because to him, anything that disturbed the calm of his shift was a chance to prove that he was the one in power. His eyes swept across the crowd, saw the customer pointing, saw Maeve standing in front of the storeroom door, with both arms spread as if trying to protect something behind her back, and a cruel smile briefly pulled at the corner of his mouth. Sullivan, he called her name, not in a whisper but with all the volume he could summon, enough to make every face in the diner turn in one direction. "What are you hiding behind your back?" Maeve swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice low, and softly said that it was only her private matter, that she was asking him to let the two of them talk somewhere else. But Petrosky had already strode forward, shoved her shoulder aside with a rough bump, and yanked the storeroom door wide open. The whole diner went silent. In the dark corner between the shelves and the stacked sacks of flour, Brianni sat there, small and pale in an oversized sweater, her wide eyes staring up at the strange man who stood towering over her and blocking out the light. one hand still clutching the sketchbook to her chest as if it were the only shield she had. Petrovsky let out an incredulous sneer, then turned back to face the entire dining room, spreading his arms wide like an actor savoring his moment on stage. "Everybody take a look," he said, his voice ringing with triumph and malice. "Our model waitress here has been secretly turning my storeroom into a nursery. She hid a sick little kid among the food supplies, while smiling and serving all of you as if nothing was wrong." Maeve pushed herself between him and the door, her back straightening even though her face had gone pale, and in a trembling voice that was not begging, she said the child had only been sitting quietly and drawing, that she had not touched anything, that the school had called her at dawn to say the girl was unwell, and she could not find anyone else to watch her. Petrovsky did not bother to listen. He only waved his hand as if shooing away a fly, and said he did not care about her sad little stories, that this was a business, not an orphanage. In a hidden corner at the far end of the diner, where the yellow light did not reach, a man in a worn old coat sat perfectly still, the coffee in his hand long gone cold. Darius Kane did not move. Not a single muscle in his face shifted, but his knuckles had whitened around the cup, and his cold gray eyes locked onto the scene before him with a stillness more frightening than any rage. He had seen every kind of person in his life, traitors, cowards, people ready to sell out anyone just to climb one step higher. But there was one thing that always made the deepest part of him burn in silence, and that was the sight of someone powerful choosing to trample someone weaker simply because he could. He looked at the young woman standing there, her back perfectly straight in the middle of humiliation, one hand still unconsciously reaching behind her, as if to reassure the little sister hiding in the shadows, and for one very brief moment, that image touched something he had buried for a very long time. Petrovsky was still talking, his voice growing louder and louder, every word falling like a hammer blow, but Darius could barely hear him anymore, because all his attention was now fixed on the slender girl bracing herself to endure it all without collapsing, and on the question growing inside his mind, how exhausted, how alone, must a person be to have no choice but to bring her sick little sister to work, and hide her behind storage shelves just so she could keep earning a living. Petrovsky planted both hands on his hips, tilted his chin toward her, with the delighted look of a man who had been waiting a long time for this moment, and said this was not the first time, that he had noticed for weeks the way she kept sneaking into the storeroom, the minute she disappeared from the floor, and now he had proof with his own eyes of what he had suspected all along. Maeve lowered her voice until it was almost a whisper. She stepped one pace closer to him, her green eyes already red-rimmed but still forcing themselves to look straight up, and she said she was begging him, only begging him for one thing, not to do this here, not in front of the child, that they could go into the office, and she would explain everything, would accept whatever discipline he thought was proper. But that very humility only poured more oil onto the fire of his satisfaction, because Petrovsky had never been the kind of man who knew how to stop when someone was already on their knees. And he raised his voice and answered that no, he wanted everyone here to know. He wanted every customer sitting in this place to understand that they had been eating food, served by someone who had no respect for rules, someone willing to place her own hardship above sanitation, above the safety of the workplace, above the jobs of the other people who had been forced to carry the work she left behind. "Do you know how many tables had to wait longer today, because you kept running in and out?" he asked, even though everyone in the room could plainly see that her co-workers had quietly shared her duties so smoothly that not a single person had complained. Maeve did not answer. She only stood there, her calloused hands clenched together in front of her stomach, and every word he threw at her seemed to make her thin shoulders sink a little lower, though her chin still refused to drop. He pulled the shift logbook from his pocket, flipped through a few pages in front of her like a judge reading a sentence, then announced that from this moment on, she was no longer employed by the diner, that he was firing her immediately for serious misconduct, and that she could collect her things and leave at once. Maeve gave a small shiver, and for the first time, her voice cracked a little as she asked about her pay for tonight's shift, saying she had worked the whole shift from the afternoon until now, that she needed that money, truly needed it. Petrovsky laughed, a dry and cruel sound, and said she should have thought about that before turning the workplace into a babysitting room, that he would keep that money to cover the damage caused by her negligence, and that if she was not happy with it, she was free to go sue him. By now, the whole diner had sunk into a suffocating silence. A few customers lowered their faces toward their plates, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one dared speak up, because standing against a man drunk on power had never been an easy thing to do. It was then that from the table beside the window, an elderly woman with snow-white hair set her fork down hard on her plate, the sharp ring of metal against porcelain cutting through the air. The old woman pushed the glasses, slipping down the bridge of her nose back into place, lifted her eyes straight to Petrosky, and in a voice trembling with age yet full of authority, she said she had eaten in this diner for many years and had never witnessed anything so shameful. "Are you firing a young woman because she could not bear to leave her sick little sister home alone?" she asked. "And are you also planning to steal the money she sweated to earn?" Petrosky snapped his head toward her, his face darkening, and he was about to open his mouth to answer, but the old woman lifted one wrinkled hand to stop him, saying she did not need to hear his excuses, that the way a person treated someone who had nothing with which to defend herself was the truest measure of who that person really was. In the hidden corner, Darius still sat motionless, but the corner of his mouth moved slightly, something very close to approval flashing through his gray eyes, though he did not say a word. Maeve turned toward the old woman, and for the first time throughout that storm of humiliation, her eyes filled with tears, not because of shame, but because of an unexpected kindness at the very moment when she had thought the whole world had turned its back on her. She gave the woman a small nod, a thank you she could not put into words, then quietly turned and walked toward the storeroom, where her little sister was still waiting in the shadows, to do the only thing left that she could do, take the child away from this place, with the last piece of dignity no one had the right to take from them. Maeve stepped into the storeroom, knelt down to her sister's level, and in a voice so gentle that no one could have believed it belonged to the same young woman who had just endured that storm of humiliation, she softly told Bryony that they were going home now. Sweetheart, that it was time to leave. Bryony lifted her tired eyes to her sister, her small face still carrying the bewildered look of a child who had not fully understood all those cruel words, only knowing that something was wrong, that her sister was sad, and by instinct she reached out her thin arms and wrapped them around Maeve's neck. Maeve slid her hands beneath her and lifted her up, and the 9-year-old child rested weightlessly against her shoulder, with the limp softness of a body worn out by exhaustion, one hand still clutching the old sketchbook tightly to her chest, as if she had not let it go for even a second. She carried her sister through the diner, past the faces still stunned by what had just happened, past the lowered eyes of coworkers who did not dare look up, and she walked with her back perfectly straight, her chin lifted just high enough that no one could say she had fallen apart, even though inside her chest everything was breaking into pieces. Near the glass door that led outside, where the October rain was lashing long crooked streaks of water across the window, Bryony's arm loosened in sleepiness, and the sketchbook slipped from her small embrace, falling onto the tile right at the threshold, where rainwater from customers' shoes had gathered in a blotchy puddle. The book fell open to the very page she had been drawing in the storeroom, and Maeve looked down and saw her sister's childish pencil lines, sketching 3 figures standing close together beneath an umbrella, one tall grown person, one smaller one, and one tiny child in the middle, with the wobbly words "Our Home" written above them in a child's hand. Rainwater soaked into the page, making the blue pencil lines spread and blur, causing those 3 figures to look as if they were melting into one another. And for one moment Maeve stood frozen, staring at the picture being washed away at her feet, because that was everything the child had ever dreamed of. A home, a whole family, something Maeve had struggled so hard to preserve, and now it seemed to be slipping from her hands too, just like those fading lines. She bent down, one arm still holding Bryony, the other trembling as she picked up the sketchbook and pressed it against her chest along with the child, trying to wipe the water away with the hem of her uniform, as if saving that page might also mean saving the dream it carried. It was in the moment she lifted her head, her auburn hair falling across one wet cheek, that her eyes accidentally met the gaze of the man sitting in the shadowed corner. Darius did not quickly look away the way everyone else had. He held her gaze, and in one brief second between two complete strangers, something passed between them without the need for words. Not the pity she had always hated with every part of herself, but a quiet understanding, as if that man had once stood exactly where she was standing, had once held close a piece of a dream, being blurred by rain in the very same way. Maeve was the one who looked away first. She had no time for the gaze of a stranger. She tightened her hold around her sister and the sketchbook, pushed open the glass door, and stepped outside, and at once the icy rain fell over both of them, soaking through her thin clothes in only a few steps. But she did not stop. She lowered her head to shield Brioni from the drops and walked toward the dark road, with no umbrella, no car, only two living souls leaning on each other in the October rain. Inside the diner, Darius kept watching that small figure until it blended into the gray sheet of water and disappeared completely, and he remained seated there for a long time after she was gone, the cold coffee still motionless in his hand. The image of the young woman carrying her sister into the rain had quietly touched some door he thought he had sealed forever, and deep in his memory, a blurred figure from more than 20 years ago flickered back, a man who had once not turned away from him on the night when he had nothing left but hunger and despair, appearing only for an instant before vanishing, yet long enough to make his hardened heart ache in a strange way he himself could not name. After the glass door had closed behind the two sisters, and the diner slowly began to recover its ordinary sounds, Petrovsky brushed off his hands with the satisfaction of a man who had just cleared away an inconvenience, adjusted his collar, and turned toward the cash register, ready to return to the tiny authority he believed was untouchable. It was at that moment that the man in the worn old coat sitting in the shadowed corner set his coffee cup down on the table, stood without hurry, and walked toward the counter, with steps so unhurried they were almost leisurely. He stopped in front of Petrovsky, and in a low, weightless voice, almost polite, asked whether he might know the man's full name. Petrovsky looked him up and down, taking in the faded coat, the mud-stained shoes, the tired face of someone he guessed was some long-distance driver, and answered in a superior tone that if he had a complaint, he could leave a message, because he did not have time for every stray customer. The man only gave a slight nod, then reached into the inside pocket of his coat, pulled out a business card made of thick ivory-colored paper, placed it on the counter directly in front of him, and pushed it gently toward him with two fingertips. Petrovsky lowered his eyes, and he read a name printed in simple raised letters, Darius Kane, and beneath it, the title of chairman of the corporation that owned the restaurant chain of which this diner was only one small link, and for one moment his greasy face froze, the blood draining from his flushed cheek so quickly that he looked as if he had aged 10 years. Because that name was not merely the name of the owner. In this city, the name Kane carried whispers in the dark, stories people only dared tell when they were certain no one was listening, and Petrovsky, no matter how foolish he was, knew perfectly well that he had just treated an employee with cruelty right in front of the most powerful man he had ever had the chance to stand near. Darius did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He only rested one elbow on the counter, leaned toward him slightly, and began speaking in that calm, even voice that chilled the spine more than any shout could have done. He said that over the past 7 months, this branch alone had lost 11 employees one after another, and the interesting thing was that most of them had left only a few weeks after filing complaints about management, complaints that somehow disappeared from the system before ever reaching the desks of higher supervisors. He went on, still in that light tone, saying that he had also noticed the numbers in the branch accounts, the steady gap between actual revenue and reported revenue each week, the inflated supply orders and the wages shaved from people's shifts. And then he asked him in an extremely mild voice whether any of those numbers felt familiar. Petrovsky opened his mouth to explain himself, but not a single sound came out. His hands gripped the edge of the counter so tightly they trembled, and the sweat now spilling across his forehead was no longer from the heat of the kitchen, but from something cold rising up from the base of his spine. Darius straightened, saying that he did not need to answer, that every answer was already contained in the file his people had prepared, and that from this moment on he was no longer part of the corporation. His contract was terminated immediately, and every debt and violation would be handled by the legal department in the coming days. Just then, from outside the door, Two broad-shouldered men in dark suits entered, quietly approached and stood on either side of Petrosky, and one of them politely extended a hand, inviting him outside so certain necessary procedures could be discussed. Not one threat was spoken, not one rough gesture took place, but everyone in the diner felt the invisible weight pressing down over the room, and Petrosky, his face drained of every drop of color, silently walked away between the two men, the swagger he had worn only a few minutes earlier completely dissolved, leaving behind a stunned silence that covered everyone who had witnessed it. Darius turned and looked over the shocked faces of the employees, and his gaze stopped on a middle-aged woman with a resolute face, the woman who had been standing near the kitchen door, watching everything unfold. He asked her name, and when she quietly answered that she was Ruth Delacroix, that she had worked here for many years, he nodded and said that from now on she would temporarily run the diner until the corporation arranged everything properly, that he trusted someone who had stayed so long must understand this place better than anyone. Ruth could only nod in astonishment, and Darius put his coat back on, turning his eyes toward the glass door, where the rain was still lashing down in waves onto the empty street, where the two sisters had long since disappeared, and in his mind, a quiet decision had already formed, that he would find out exactly who that girl was. The following night, in the office on the upper floor of a building overlooking the harbor, glittering with lights, Darius sat silently behind the dark wooden desk, and Cormac, the loyal man who had stood beside him for many years, placed a thin file in front of him and began presenting the report in his familiar calm voice. The girl's full name is Maeve Sullivan. 26 years old, Cormac began, and he said that what they had found about this young woman's life was far heavier than anyone could have guessed from her quiet appearance. Her mother, a woman who had worked as a seamstress to raise her two daughters, had died of cancer when Maeve had just turned 19, after nearly 2 years of fighting that had drained both the family's strength and their last dollars. Darius frowned slightly. He said nothing, only lifted a hand to turn the silver ring on his finger, an unconscious habit whenever something touched the hidden places inside him. Cormac went on, saying that the father, who had never been much of a solid support to begin with, gave up completely after his wife's death. He sank into alcohol, then one day left without a single word of farewell, abandoning the two sisters alone in a city where they no longer had anyone close to them. And at that time, the youngest child, Brianni, was only 2 years old. He paused for a beat, as if letting that truth settle, then continued that at the moment when everything seemed about to collapse, Maeve had been in her final year of a nursing program at a community college, a path she had struggled hard to enter, with the dream of becoming a nurse and someday being able to care for her little family on her own. But she wrote her withdrawal form with her own hand only a few weeks after her father disappeared. Cormac said, because without an adult stepping forward to take responsibility, her little sister would have been placed into the foster system, and the two sisters would have been separated forever. Darius lifted his head, his gray eyes glinting with something difficult to read, and for the first time since Cormac had begun speaking, he asked one short question, that she had given up everything just to keep her sister with her. Cormac nodded in confirmation, saying that she had filed for legal guardianship of her sister, as soon as the law allowed, had gone to court, had proven before strangers that a 19-year-old girl, with no home and no profession could still be strong enough to support another living soul, and with a willpower that even Cormac himself had quietly admired while reading the file, she had won. But the burden had not ended there. His voice lowered as he moved into the hardest part, because little Brianni had been born with a defect in her heart, a congenital condition that kept her small heart from working fully the way other children's hearts did, and the older she grew, the more her condition required medical intervention. The doctors had recommended a surgery to repair that defect, a complicated and expensive operation, but the insurance company had refused to cover it on the grounds that the condition had existed before the policy, pushing that enormous burden entirely onto the already overloaded shoulders of the older sister. Darius tightened the hand resting on the desk, his knuckles drawing faintly taut, but his face still held its usual calm. Cormac said that Maeve had done everything she could. She had taken 2 jobs at once, working night shifts at the diner and squeezing in short day shifts wherever anyone would hire her. She had applied for medical assistance from the city support fund, but that application had been rejected because of a small procedural error related to her employment status and her age, and the appeal process kept moving slowly, as though deliberately wearing away the last hope of those who were already suffering most. The only relative left was an elderly aunt living in a town quite far away, unable to drive and unable to help much beyond phone calls to check on them. Cormac closed the report, then said that in short, the girl had almost no support network at all, that everything she had told the manager yesterday had been completely true, and that she had carried all of it alone for several years without collapsing. The room fell into a long silence after Cormac stopped speaking. Darius turned in his chair and looked out through the large glass window. The lights from the harbor faintly reflected in his thoughtful gray eyes, and inside the man who had witnessed every dark face life could show, a very strange emotion began to rise. Not pity, but a silent respect mingled with something far deeper than that. When Cormac had withdrawn and Darius was left alone in the room sunk in dim shadow, he remained seated there for a very long time, the harbor lights casting interwoven bands of brightness and darkness across his face, and inside his mind, an old reflex immediately stirred, the same way it had always done through all the years behind him. Because to Darius, every problem in this world could be reduced to two things, money and power, and he was used to solving every trouble by throwing out one of those two things, or both at once, swiftly, cleanly, decisively, with no lingering loose ends. The first thought that flashed through him followed that same worn path, that all he needed to do was order Cormac to transfer a sum large enough into the girl's account, enough to cover her sister's surgery, enough so she wouldn't have to bend her back working 2 or 3 jobs at the same time, enough to erase the burden crushing those thin shoulders, and that would be the end of it. He could return to his own world with his conscience a little lighter, but the moment that thought took shape, another image rose up and cut across it. It was the sight of the girl standing with her back straight in the middle of humiliation. It was the way she refused to lower her head even as everything was collapsing around her. It was the look in her eyes when she caught sight of him in the hidden corner, a look without the smallest trace of begging or expectation of pity. And Darius understood, with a certainty that startled even him, that a girl like that would never accept a single coin of charity, no matter how much good intention stood behind it. An anonymous check deposited into her account would only make her suspicious, make her afraid, make her guarded, and drive her deeper into the protective shell she had built around herself. Because to people who had grown used to being deceived and betrayed by life, kindness without a reason was often more frightening than cruelty itself. He realized that what that girl needed wasn't a gift dropped from the sky, but an opportunity she could seize with her own hands, something she could step into with her head held high and her hands clean, something that allowed her to keep the thing she valued most, her own dignity. And strangely enough, that realization stirred something in him even deeper than sympathy, because it echoed something he himself had once lived through, something only those who had stood at the very bottom of life could truly understand. He was still submerged in those thoughts when there came a soft knock at the door, and Cormac returned, this time with an unusually cautious look on his face. Cormac stepped closer to the desk and said in a lowered voice that there was something he felt compelled to remind him of, even though he knew it wasn't his place. He said that for many years, Darius had always kept one unbreakable rule, and that was never to let himself become too deeply involved with anyone or anything outside of business, because in the world they were living in, every personal concern could become a weakness, an opening for others to exploit, and the fact that he had suddenly chosen to personally keep an eye on a small branch, personally fire a low-level manager, and now investigate a waitress in such detail, all those unusual things wouldn't escape the eyes of those who were always watching every movement he made. Cormac reminded him that the enemies in the dark, especially Holloway's faction, who had been eyeing his territory for a long time, wouldn't miss any sign that the iron-hearted Darius Kane was beginning to have a soft place. And if they discovered that he cared about that girl, then she and her sister, no matter how innocent they were, could be dragged into dangerous schemes they never deserved to endure. Darius listened in silence, and he understood very well that what Cormac said was the truth, the warning of a loyal friend, not the objection of a coward. For one moment, the cold reason that had helped him survive for so many years told him he should stop, that he should close that file and forget the girl as he would forget a passing story. But then he thought again of the rain-blurred sheet of paper, of the 3 small figures melting into one another beneath the umbrella, and something inside him, something that had awakened in the corner of the restaurant the night before, stubbornly refused to fall asleep again. He rose, walked to the window, and after a long stretch of silence, he quietly told Cormac that he had made his decision, that he wanted to meet the girl in person, not to bestow anything upon her, but to offer her a choice, and that whatever risks might come, he would bear them himself. 2 days later, in the late afternoon when the restaurant was still nearly empty between shifts, Maeve stepped through that glass door once again, but this time she wasn't wearing her uniform. She had on an old, worn sweater, and wariness showed clearly in every movement she made. The call from an unfamiliar number 2 days earlier had left her thinking through the entire night. A man who claimed to be the owner of the corporation that owned the restaurant, a man who had witnessed everything, and wanted to meet her to discuss something. And she would have refused, outright, if it hadn't been for the 3 words he mentioned at the end of the call: Brianni's surgery. She brought her little sister with her, because she had no one to leave the child with, but more than that, because she would never let the girl out of her sight while walking into a meeting she couldn't predict. Maeve stopped near the door, swept her eyes once around the whole restaurant before stepping fully inside, and when she saw the man sitting at the corner table, she walked toward him but still kept a certain distance, pulling Brianni close against her side, one hand resting lightly on the girl's thin shoulder as though ready to shield her at any moment. Darius stood when she came near, and this time he was no longer wearing the old coat he had used as a disguise. Instead, he wore a dark suit tailored with care, his tall frame giving off the kind of authority that the frayed jacket from the other day had skillfully hidden. He politely invited the 2 sisters to sit down, his low voice still carrying that same calm composure. But Maeve didn't sit right away. She guided Brianni inward first, placing her close to the corner of the wall where it was safest, then finally sat down lightly on the edge of the chair across from him, her back straight and both hands resting on her thighs in the posture of someone who was always ready to rise and walk away. An employee brought out a cup of hot chocolate and a plate of cookies for Brianni, but Maeve gently pulled the plate closer to herself and checked it with a quick glance before pushing it toward her sister, and that small gesture didn't escape Darius's eyes, though he said nothing. After a shy moment, Brianni opened her sketchbook, took out her only blue pencil, and began to draw quietly, completely unaware of the weight of the conversation taking place right above her head. Darius began by saying he would get straight to the point, because he guessed she wasn't someone who liked people talking in circles, and he said what he had witnessed that day wasn't only an injustice, but had also shown him something else, the way she worked. He said that during more than an hour of sitting and watching before everything happened, he had seen her handle 8 tables at once, without missing a single detail, had seen her soothe a difficult customer before that person could even raise their voice, had seen her quietly take on a coworker's extra work without ever asking for recognition, and he said that kind of ability wasn't something people could be taught. It was instinct, and that instinct was far rarer than she imagined. Maeve didn't answer. Her green eyes remained fixed on him, with the waiting look of someone trying to figure out where the trap was, because bitter experience had taught her that generous praise usually came with some kind of price. Darius seemed to read that guardedness. He wasn't offended at all, only calmly placed a thin folder on the table, pushed it gently toward her, and said he wanted to invite her to work as shift manager and operations supervisor for this very branch. He said it was an official position with a salary many times higher than her current income from both jobs combined, along with full health insurance for both her and Brianni, and he paused for a beat before continuing with the most important part, that the corporation's insurance package and benefits would include full coverage for the heart surgery her sister needed. When those words were spoken, Maeve's hands tightened slightly on her thighs, and for one extremely brief moment, her eyes flicked toward the little girl bent over her drawing, a quick glance that held an entire sky of longing, which she immediately forced back down, pulling her defensive wall back into place. She didn't cry out in joy, didn't burst into tears, didn't snatch up the folder the way he may have quietly expected. She only sat there, her face drawn tight with the effort of keeping her emotions from showing, because that gift, too large and too perfectly timed, awakened in her a deeper caution than ever before. Beside her, Brianni lifted her head slightly from the page, her clear eyes looking at the strange man and then at her sister, sensing that something important had just happened even though she didn't understand what it was. And she silently inched a little closer to Maeve, while Maeve, after a stretch of silence so long it seemed possible to hear the fine rain whispering outside the door, finally began to speak slowly. She said she thanked him for the offer, and that she understood how generous it was, but she couldn't accept it, and she said those words in a voice so calm it felt almost cold, the voice of someone who had made her decision before she ever set foot inside this place. Darius tilted his head slightly, showing no surprise, and only asked her why. Maeve looked straight into his gray eyes. The eyes she had heard enough rumors about to know that behind that composure was a world she never wanted to become entangled with. She lowered her voice, just enough so Brianni, who was absorbed in her drawing, wouldn't hear. And she said she knew who he was, Mr. Kane. That in this city, people didn't need to say his name out loud for others to understand what it stood for. That people who worked night shifts in restaurants and cafes like her still heard stories whispered in kitchens about his business dealings, about the way people who stood in his path disappeared quietly. She said she wasn't judging him. She had neither the right nor the time to judge anyone. But she had lived long enough in the hard part of life to understand one very simple rule, that nothing in this world was given for free, and the larger the gift, the steeper the price that had to be paid later. Darius remained silent and listened without interrupting, and that silence of his seemed to draw out everything Maeve had been holding inside. She said that if she accepted this job, accepted this money, accepted her sister's surgery from his hand, then she would forever be indebted to him, a debt that wouldn't appear on any piece of paper, but would weigh more heavily than any loan she had ever known. And one day, maybe next month, maybe several years from now, when he needed something, anything at all, she would no longer be in a position to say no. Her voice trembled slightly as she went on, saying that she had once believed in kindness without conditions, had once believed that when she fell to the bottom, someone would reach out a hand without expecting anything in return. But life had taught her lessons she had paid for with blood and tears, that the people who had reached their hands out to her before, almost all of them, had come back to demand something she didn't want to give, or couldn't give. And she glanced quickly toward her little sister once more, the look of a mother more than a sister, then said with the full weight of a silent vow that the child was all she had left in this world, the only reason she still woke up every morning, and that she would rather bend her back, working 3 or 4 jobs until she collapsed than place her sister's fate in the hands of a man she couldn't be certain would never one day ask her to trade away her conscience. She said she couldn't let Brianni grow up beneath a roof, built with money whose source she didn't dare look straight at, that she wanted to teach the child that no matter how poor a person was, they could still live with their head held high, and if she accepted his offer today, she would betray the very lesson she was struggling to teach her sister every day. Each word she spoke was like another brick added to the wall she was building between them, and paradoxically, the more she spoke, the more her heart tightened with pain, because one part of her, the part that had been exhausted after years of carrying everything alone, was screaming at her to seize the lifeline drifting right in front of her, to think of her sister's small heart that was faltering inside her chest, to stop being proud for once in her life. But she strangled that voice, because to her, dignity wasn't a luxury. It was the last possession she had left, the only boundary between still being a human being and becoming something that could be bought and sold. She stood up, pulled Brianni to her feet with her, and spoke her final words in a voice that had regained its hardness, saying that she was truly grateful he had thrown out that manager, that this alone was already a favor she would remember. But her answer was still no, and she hoped he would respect that decision without making things difficult for her. Then she bent down, gathered her sister's notebook and pencil into the old cloth bag, took Brianni's small hand, and prepared to turn and walk away, carrying both her fear and her wretched pride out through that door, leaving behind the chance that anyone else would have seized without the slightest hesitation. When Maeve had taken her sister's hand and turned halfway toward the door, Darius's deep voice sounded behind her, not to stop her or command her, but only like a quiet confession released into the empty space. He said that when he was 16 years old, he had once slept 3 straight nights in the alley behind a small restaurant, so hungry his hands shook too badly to hold anything, and on that 4th night he had slipped into the restaurant's back kitchen to steal food. Maeve froze. She didn't fully turn around, but she had stopped walking, and Darius continued, his eyes no longer looking at her now, but seeming to gaze through the wall toward some faraway place in the past. He told her that the owner of the restaurant, an old Italian man named Salvatore Bruno, caught him in the act while he was hurriedly stuffing a piece of bread into his coat pocket, and by the way life usually worked for children like him, the old man only needed to pick up the phone and call the police, and it would have been over. He would have been thrown into juvenile detention, and his life would have turned down a road he might never have climbed back out of. But Salvatore didn't do that, Darius said, and his voice lowered slightly around that name, as if it still carried a weight after all those years. Instead of calling the police, the old man only looked at him silently for a long while, then pulled out a chair, set a steaming plate of pasta and a glass of milk in front of him, and told him to sit down and eat properly first. Then they could talk about whatever needed talking about. He said he had devoured that food in extreme caution, waiting for the trap, waiting for the trick, exactly the way Maeve was guarding herself against him now, because a street child like him back then had also learned the same bitter lesson she had just spoken aloud, that nothing in this world was given for free. But Salvatore didn't ask for anything. He only asked whether Darius wanted a job washing dishes, and the next morning, he gave him a place to sleep in the small room above the restaurant, a clean set of clothes, and a reason to wake up every day. Darius paused, and in that moment, the most powerful man in the city's shadows looked almost vulnerable. He said that one night, when he asked the old man why he would trust a thieving boy like him, why he would dare to place a wager on someone for whom the whole world had already written a terrible ending, Salvatore said something to him that he had carried for the rest of his life. The old man told him that he didn't need the whole world to believe in him. He only needed one person, and sometimes one person was all it took to change everything. Maeve had now turned all the way back around, her green eyes looking at him with something changed in them, no longer pure suspicion, but also the confusion of someone who had just realized she was looking into a mirror reflecting her own pain. Darius lifted his eyes to hers, and he went on with a naked honesty that caught her off guard, saying that he wouldn't stand there and pretend he was a good man, that most of the rumors she had heard weren't wrong, that his hands had done things he could never wash clean, and he didn't intend to deny them. He said he had walked a road that would have broken Salvatore's heart if the old man had still been alive to see it, that after Salvatore passed away, he had allowed anger and survival to lead him into the world whose summit he now stood upon, a world filled with power, but also filled with blood and loneliness. But then his voice steadied again, and he gestured around the small restaurant. He said that these restaurants, this chain of ordinary diners he had built, were the only clean part of his life, the place where he tried to do something again that resembled what Salvatore had once done for him. He said this was where he hired people other places had rejected, people who had made mistakes, people no one was willing to give a chance to, and that he hadn't built them to launder money or hide anything the way people rumored, but because he needed a place to remind himself that there was still some small piece left of the 16-year-old boy who had been saved by a stranger. He looked straight into her eyes and said he had come to her not to buy her, not to turn her into someone indebted to him, but because that day, when he saw her carrying her sister into the rain, he had seen himself from 20 years before. And he understood that now he was standing exactly where Salvatore once stood, being handed a chance to become the one person she needed. He said he wasn't asking her to trust him right away. He was only asking her not to let her pride take away from Briani the chance that she herself, at 19 years old, must have wished she had been given, and that if one day she ever saw him ask anything of her that went against her conscience, she had every right to stand up and walk away, and he would never stop her. Maeve stood motionless in the middle of the restaurant, her heart torn between the defensive wall she had painstakingly built and the story that had just carved into it a crack she hadn't expected, and Darius, as if sensing that hesitation, didn't press her at all. He simply sat down and opened the folder on the table, turning it toward her. He said he understood that empty words held little value for someone who had been betrayed too many times, so he wanted her to look at the written lines for herself. He showed her the employment contract, drafted clearly, every clause about salary, hours and benefits laid out plainly, not one vague line, not one hidden obligation, and more importantly, he turned to the page about the corporation's medical assistance fund. A real fund that had been operating for many years, with a list of employees whose hospital bills it had covered, with specific figures and transparent terms that she could verify. He said Brianni's surgery would be paid through that very fund, as a benefit any official employee was entitled to receive, not as private money from his own pocket, so she would never have to feel personally indebted to him for anything. Maeve bent down to read, her eyes moving quickly across every line, with the caution of someone used to searching for traps in every sentence. And she read the section about the medical fund again and again several times, as if she didn't dare believe what she was seeing. It was in that tense moment that a clear little voice rang out and broke through the heavy air. It was Brianni. She had lifted her head from the notebook and was holding the picture she had just finished toward Darius. She asked him, "Sir, do you know what I drew here?" And without waiting for him to answer, she innocently explained that it was a whale, but a whale that could fly, because she thought if whales could fly, they would never be stranded again, and asked if he thought that was true. Darius, the man who only 1 hour earlier had made an unfeeling manager tremble, suddenly looked awkward for 1 second before leaning forward to study the drawing with fiercest tension, and answering that he thought it was very true, that a whale that could fly truly would never have to fear being stranded again, and perhaps all of us needed a pair of wings like that. Brianni grinned, delighted that her answer had been accepted, then turned to her sister and said that this man understood her drawing, and somehow that carefree childish sentence made Maeve's throat tighten. She looked at her little sister, who was smiling brightly for the first time, after so many gloomy days, looked at the pale cheeks, thought of the small heart growing more tired every day inside that fragile chest, and she understood that her pride, no matter how precious it was, could never weigh more than her sister's chance to live. She sat down again, and after a long silence, she looked up at Darius, her eyes still full of caution, but now mixed with a steel-hard resolve. She said she would try, but she wanted him to understand one thing clearly, that she was agreeing not because she had come to trust him, because trust was something that took a very long time to build, and she couldn't give it to him after only one story, but because of her sister, because she had no other choice left that could save Brianni's heart. She said she would work harder than anyone, would prove that she deserved every dollar she received, so no one could ever say she had been handed charity. Then she stated her condition in an uncompromising voice, that she wanted every agreement written clearly in black and white, and that no matter what happened, no matter how busy the work became, if Brianni needed her, if the school called, if her sister became ill, she would immediately leave everything behind and run to her, and that condition was untouchable. Darius nodded at once, without the slightest hesitation. He said that was exactly what he expected from her, and that a person who placed her sister above even the job was precisely the kind of person he wanted to entrust with responsibility. He took out a pen, added that exact clause to the contract in firm handwriting, then signed his name beneath it and pushed the pen toward her. And Maeve, after reading one final time the line that protected her little sister, took the pen with a hand that was still trembling slightly, and signed her own name, beginning an entirely new chapter she couldn't yet imagine, one that would lead her and her sister to places she couldn't yet foresee. On her first morning in the new role, Maeve arrived at the restaurant earlier than the required time, wearing a manager's shirt that still carried the scent of fresh fabric, her name embroidered in blue thread over the chest, and she stepped inside with the mindset of someone who had just been given a chance, but still didn't dare believe it was real. The atmosphere in the restaurant greeted her with a predictable caution, because for the employees who had been tied to this place for many years, the sight of a waitress who had been fired the week before, suddenly returning in a manager's shirt, was not something easy to swallow right away. Ruth Delacroix received her with cold professionalism, led her around, and handed over the work in the voice of someone who had already decided she would watch very carefully before making any judgment. In the kitchen, Maeve met Otis Wheeler, the old cook who had stood behind the stove for nearly 20 years, a quiet man with a weathered face and calloused hands. He only glanced at her once, then turned back to his pan without bothering to greet her. Maeve didn't try to win anyone over. She simply worked in silence, watched, and took notes. And while observing the rhythm of the kitchen through the busy morning, she noticed that Otis kept reaching a hand behind his back every now and then to rub it gently. And by the end of the shift, he could barely stand upright, every step carrying a strain he was trying to hide. She didn't say anything right then, but at the end of the day, when most people had cleared out, she approached him and quietly asked how long his back had been hurting like that. Otis looked up at her with the surprise of a man unaccustomed to being noticed by anyone, and he answered curtly that it had been a few years, that if a person stood for more than 10 hours on concrete floors, of course they would end up like that. Then he waved his hand as though it wasn't worth anyone's concern. But Maeve didn't let it pass. She said that standing non-stop on hard flooring through long shifts was a real health issue, not something people should have to grit their teeth and endure. And that very afternoon, she personally wrote a proposal to the facilities department, requesting a tall reclining chair to be placed beside the kitchen area, so Otis and the other cooks could sit and rest for a little while during slower moments without having to leave their station. When the chair was delivered a few days later, Otis didn't say a word of thanks. He only stood there looking at it for a long time, then placed his hand on the arm of the chair, as though he still couldn't believe his eyes. And from that day on, the way he looked at her changed. There was no longer indifference there, but a quiet recognition, given in his own way. The second person she reached was Jonah Reed, the 22-year-old prep cook with messy hair and an openly skeptical attitude. He was the most obvious one in showing that he didn't accept her, often dropping indirect remarks about how some people didn't need to do much at all to get promoted. Maeve heard all of it, but didn't answer back. She only chose to work twice as hard so he could see for himself. And on one peak night, when orders piled up, and Jonah became so flustered he nearly panicked, she was the one who rolled up her sleeves and jumped in to help him wash and prep, standing beside him in the heat and sweat without a single complaint or command. When the rush finally passed, Jonah looked at her, breathless, and for the first time he spoke to her in a voice with some of its sharpness gone, saying he was sorry for the ugly things he had said before, and that he had never seen a manager willing to come down into the kitchen and work alongside ordinary staff like him. Maeve only smiled faintly and said she had been ordinary staff herself less than 2 weeks ago, and that she didn't think any job in this restaurant was lower than any other. But what Maeve quietly paid attention to most during those early days was Darius. She had prepared herself for the possibility that he would come around often, would supervise her, would find ways to impose his will or demand something from her, just as her guarded instincts kept warning her. But that didn't happen. He kept every word written in the contract, never crossing the line even once. All contact went through human resources in an official way, and when she needed to leave early one afternoon to take Brianni to a follow-up appointment, her request was approved immediately, without a single twisting question, exactly as stated in the clause about her sister that he had written in by his own hand. She kept waiting for the hidden price to reveal itself, kept waiting for the moment he would remind her that she owed him. But day after day, that moment never came, and its absence paradoxically left her more bewildered than its presence would have. The only time he stopped by during the first week, he stayed at the counter for only a few minutes, asked Ruth about the general situation, then left quietly, and before he went, he sent Maeve only one brief message, telling her to keep doing things in the way she believed was right, that he had hired her to trust her instincts, not to force her to follow his will. And it was in those small, quiet things that the first brick of trust, though she still didn't dare give it a name, began to be laid down timidly inside the heart of a girl who had forgotten what it felt like to trust anyone at all. But not every door opened that easily, and the greatest obstacle in Maeve's first weeks came from somewhere she hadn't expected: Della Vance, the cashier who had worked at the restaurant for nearly 10 years, a woman close to 40, whose face always seemed to carry a trace of dissatisfaction. Della had been one of Petrosky's trusted people, someone the former manager had favored and looked the other way for, while she slipped small discrepancies into her own pocket. so his firing and the sudden promotion of a very young girl had quietly planted resentment inside her. She didn't oppose Maeve openly the way Jonah had, but chose to sabotage things in a far more subtle way. She began mixing up order slips so the kitchen would prepare the wrong dishes, deliberately entering a few bills incorrectly so the revenue figures wouldn't match at the end of the shift, then hiding part of the cash and arranging everything so that every mistake appeared to come from the new manager's inexperience. Within 2 weeks, strange gaps began appearing in the restaurant's books, and Maeve realized that if the situation continued, she would be the first person suspected, because she was the newest name there, the easiest one to blame. But instead of panicking or rushing to accuse anyone, Maeve did what her careful nature had been trained to do through so many years of hardship. She quietly watched and gathered evidence. She began arriving earlier and leaving later, comparing every order slip with every receipt, recording the time of each transaction, and little by little, a pattern came clearly into view. All those discrepancies happened during shifts when Della was present, and all of them revolved around transactions handled by Della herself. When Maeve had enough evidence in hand to make anyone bow their head and confess, she stood before a choice, and she chose the path that few people in her position would have chosen. She didn't report Della to the higher-ups, didn't call security, didn't turn the matter into a public punishment like the one she herself had once suffered. Instead, one evening after the restaurant closed, she asked Della to stay behind, placed the file of reconciled records on the table in front of her, and said in a calm voice without a trace of triumph or threat that she knew everything. Della went pale. At first she still tried to deny it, but when she saw the evidence arranged neatly and meticulously down to every detail, she understood that every excuse was useless, and the arrogance on her face collapsed into the fear of someone who had already seen the possibility of losing a job at an age when finding a new one would be painfully difficult. But what Maeve said next left her stunned. She said she wouldn't report this to Mr. Kane, at least not yet, and that she was giving Della a chance. She said she understood what it felt like to be backed into a corner, understood the fear of having one's livelihood threatened, and she guessed there must be some reason behind what Della had done. Della, overwhelmed as her emotions broke open, finally confessed that she was raising her sick elderly mother alone, that the money she had siphoned off under Petrosky had been used to pay her mother's hospital bills, and that she had resented Maeve only because she was afraid the new manager would discover it and push her into ruin. Maeve listened in silence, and in Della's story she saw a twisted version of the same desperation she herself had once tasted. She said what Della had done was wrong and couldn't happen again, but she believed that a person who did wrong out of desperation was still different from someone who did wrong out of greed. She proposed that if Della ended every act of sabotage and went back to working honestly, Maeve would show her how to access the corporation's medical assistance fund to take care of her mother properly, something Della hadn't even known existed. Della burst into tears, and for the first time in many years, that hardened woman looked at someone younger than herself with genuine gratitude instead of envy. None of this escaped Ruth Delacroix, who had been quietly watching how Maeve handled things from the very beginning, and one evening, when only the two of them remained, Ruth called her over. She wasn't gentle at all. She pointed out several parts of Maeve's handling that she considered too soft, warned her that kindness placed in the wrong hands could be exploited, and made her establish a stricter control system so this would never happen again. But at the end of that stern conversation, Ruth looked at her for a while, and then said in a lower voice that even so, the way Maeve had given someone a road back, instead of forcing them against the wall, was something she hadn't seen in this place for a very long time, and that perhaps she had been wrong to think Maeve had been brought here only because of luck. The sisters' lives gradually settled into a steadier rhythm than they had ever known before, and for the first time in many years, Maeve allowed herself to believe that perhaps the worst days had been left behind. But it was often precisely when a person began to feel safe that old fear returned and knocked at the door. Late one night, when both sisters were asleep in the small apartment, Maeve jolted awake at the faint sound from the next room, and when she stepped in, she saw Brianni sitting up in bed, breathing with a little more difficulty than usual, her small shoulders rising and falling gently with each breath, her face tired and paler beneath the dim glow of the nightlight. She didn't cry, didn't shout, only lifted her sleepy eyes to look at her sister, and whispered that she felt a little tired, and that fragile voice immediately made Maeve's heart tighten. In that moment, all the fears she had tried to bury for so long suddenly surged up in a violent rush, because she knew better than anyone that her little sister's heart wasn't as healthy as other children's, and the instinct of someone used to having every good thing snatched from her hands at any moment warned her that she could not afford to be careless. She tried to keep her voice calm so she wouldn't frighten the child, helped her into a warm coat, wrapped her in a soft blanket, then called a car to take the two of them to the nearest emergency clinic in the middle of the night. All the way there, Maeve held her sister in her arms, one hand gently stroking her hair, her lips whispering tender words of reassurance. But inside, her mind was a storm of self-reproach. She began to wonder whether she had become so absorbed in her new job that she had neglected the child, whether she had been wrong to let herself believe in a better future, whether all of this was the price she had to pay for daring to dream. That familiar feeling of failure, the feeling that no matter how hard she tried, she still wasn't good enough to protect the people she loved, tightened around her once again, just as it had during the darkest days after her mother died. At the clinic, the nurses gently took Brioni inside, and Maeve was forced to sit in the waiting area, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her eyes never leaving the door through which her sister had just been taken. Each minute dragged by like an entire century, and in that aching wait, she realized she was repeating the same old exhausting habit of her own, bracing herself to carry responsibility even for things that had always been beyond her control, blaming herself even for things no human being could have prevented. After a long while, the doctor on the night shift came out, and before Maeve could spring to her feet with a bloodless face, he gave her a reassuring smile and told her right away that the little girl was all right, that it was only a spell of fatigue caused by the colder weather, combined with her existing heart condition, which had made her a little uncomfortable, but that there was absolutely nothing dangerous. He explained that she only needed enough rest, warmth, and to avoid overexertion, and that mild spells of tiredness like this could happen until the surgery was performed. But Maeve didn't need to panic so badly every time they did. Maeve nearly buckled from relief. She stepped into the room and saw Brioni lying obediently on the hospital bed, her cheeks a little rosier now, and when she saw her sister, she gave a weak smile and said she felt better now, and that the nurse had even given her a piece of candy. Maeve held her close, pressed her face into the child's hair, and let the tears she had held back for several hours fall silently, no longer tears of fear but tears of gratitude. That night, after the two sisters had returned home, and Brioni had fallen into a peaceful, sound sleep again, Maeve sat beside her bed for a very long time, quietly watching the small rise and fall of her chest in sleep, and a truth she had been avoiding for so long finally seeped into her heart. She understood that there were things in this world that no matter how deeply she loved, no matter how hard she tried, she could never fully hold or control, that her inability to control her sister's illness didn't mean she had failed, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do wasn't to brace herself against everything, but to learn to accept what lay beyond her power and cherish each peaceful moment she still had. It was a bitter lesson she had thought she had memorized long ago, but only tonight, in the stillness after the panic, did she truly allow it to comfort her instead of torment her. A few weeks after that unforgettable night, just as Maeve was slowly growing, used to the new rhythm of life, and the bricks of trust inside her were being laid down one by one in silence, Cormac unexpectedly appeared at the restaurant one late afternoon, and from the unusually grave look on his face alone, Maeve sensed that something was wrong. He asked her to step aside into a private corner, lowered his voice, and said that Mr. Kane had run into trouble, that he was in the hospital after a tense confrontation tied to old business in the world he still hadn't been able to break away from completely. Cormac didn't go into detail. He only said that there had been tension simmering for a long time between Darius and an opposing force, and that things had reached a point where he couldn't avoid being hurt. But he reassured her right away that Darius's life was no longer in danger, and that he was now recovering. Maeve stood frozen, a flood of mixed emotions rising inside her before she could even name them: worry, confusion, and the bewildering ache of not understanding why this news made her heart sink so deeply, for a man she had always told herself to keep at a distance. She asked why Cormac had come to tell her this, because she was only an employee, not his family or even his friend, and that question made Cormac fall silent for a long while before he answered with a rare kind of honesty. If this story is stirring your heart, please take 1 second to press the like button and give us more motivation. Don't forget to share it with someone you think needs a little warmth today, and subscribe to the channel so we can welcome the next healing stories together. Now let's return to Maeve and the decision she is about to make. Cormac said he had followed Darius for nearly 15 years, had watched that man climb to the very summit of power, and had also witnessed the price he had paid for it, an absolute loneliness. He said there were always people around Darius, but all of them looked at him through the lens of fear or greed. Some bowed and obeyed. Others merely waited for one opening to take his place, and never once, throughout all those years, had anyone treated him simply as a human being, made of flesh and blood, someone who could be hurt and could feel pain. Then Cormac looked straight into her eyes and said he had watched the way she faced Darius from the very first day, the way she hadn't trembled before his name, the way she had dared to refuse him, dared to set conditions with him, dared to look at him as an ordinary man instead of a boss people had to fear. He said that in all those years, she was the first person who had managed to do that, and that even though Darius would never admit it, he believed that was exactly what that exhausted man needed most right now. Not business reports, not service or obedience, but only the presence of someone who saw him as a human being. Maeve lowered her head in silence, her heart torn, because reason still reminded her of the rumors, of the dangerous world he belonged to, of the wall she had sworn she would never lower. But then she thought of what he had done for her and her sister, thought of the way he had kept every promise, without asking for anything in return, thought of the story about the starving 16-year-old boy, who had been saved by a stranger, and she realized that if she refused to visit him only because of her own fear, then she would be no different from the whole world that had once turned its back on that boy. She thought of the lesson she herself had just absorbed so painfully on the night at the clinic, that sometimes the kindest thing a person could give was not a solution to a problem, but simply their presence beside someone in the weakest moment of that person's life. At last she lifted her head and quietly told Cormac that she would go, that she needed to arrange for Bryony to stay with someone trustworthy, and then she would come right away. Cormac nodded, a trace of relief appearing in his normally cold eyes, and he said he would personally take her there, because this wasn't something he wanted to report through official channels, but something he was doing as a friend worried about the only friend he had. And so, in that fading afternoon, Maeve found herself sitting in a car as it rolled quietly toward the hospital, her heart tangled with 100 thoughts, going to stand beside the man she had considered a danger to avoid only a few weeks before. The hospital room where Darius lay was on the highest floor of the hospital, quiet and separate, and when Maeve gently pushed the door open and stepped inside, she saw the man who had always carried an overwhelming air of authority, now leaning back against white pillows, one shoulder and arm bandaged, his face paler and more exhausted than she had ever seen it, without the familiar cold shell to shield him. He turned his head when he heard the door, and for a moment, surprise was clear in his gray eyes, because she must have been the last person he expected to appear beside his hospital bed. Maeve stood at the threshold for a while, slightly awkward, then stepped in and pulled a chair closer, sitting down at a careful distance, and she said Cormac had told her, and that she hoped he didn't mind her sudden visit. Darius curved his lips faintly into a tired smile. He said he wasn't used to people visiting him when they didn't come to discuss business or to test whether he still had enough strength to hold power. And those words, though spoken lightly, revealed an entire deep sea of loneliness he had kept hidden for so long. They sat in silence for a while, and then Maeve, instead of asking what had happened to him as ordinary courtesy might have required, gently spoke of something else. She told him about the night before, about her panic when Bryony became unwell, about sitting for hours in the waiting room and tormenting herself over things she couldn't control. Darius listened quietly, and Maeve went on, saying that that night she had learned something, or more precisely, had finally allowed herself to accept something she had avoided for a long time, that there are battles we can't win simply by bracing ourselves to be stronger. because some things were never in our hands to fight in the first place. She said she had spent her whole life trying to control everything, trying to carry every responsibility herself, because she believed that if she loosened her grip for even 1 second, everything would collapse. But that night had shown her that control was sometimes only an illusion we use to deceive ourselves, and that admitting the limits of one's own strength wasn't a sign of weakness, but the beginning of real peace. She looked straight at him and said softly that she wasn't telling him this to lecture him, but because she thought perhaps someone who always had to be strong and always had to control everything, like him, was carrying that same burden inside. Those words seemed to touch a place deep within Darius that no one had ever dared to touch before. And in the long silence that followed, something inside him seemed to crack. He turned his face toward the window, where the sunset was staining the city sky purple, and for the first time in his life, he allowed another person to see the vulnerable part of him. He began to speak, his voice low and slow, saying that he had built an entire empire on a foundation of absolute control, that he had believed if he was strong enough, powerful enough, frightening enough, he would never again have to feel as helpless as he had on the night Salvatore died, when there was nothing he could do to save him. He said the death of the only benefactor he had ever had was what had pushed him onto this road, that he had sworn never to let himself fall into weakness again, and that he had spent 20 years climbing to a height where no one could reach him and hurt him. But now, lying on a hospital bed with his body full of wounds, he said he realized that everything he had built hadn't made him untouchable the way he had imagined, that he was still alone, still surrounded by people only waiting for him to fall, and that the empire of power for which he had traded his whole soul had turned out to be a glittering prison that held him captive. He said that for a very long time now, perhaps even before he met her, he had been tired of all of this, tired of blood and betrayal, tired of always having to stay alert every minute, but he hadn't found a reason large enough to dare step away. He turned back to look at her, and in those cold gray eyes there now glimmered another kind of light, fragile and honest. He said that seeing her and her sister, seeing the way two people with almost nothing in their hands still struggled to preserve something decent and warm in the middle of a harsh life, had made him begin to wonder whether it was time for him to let go of that empire and search for something more real, something like what Salvatore had once given him. And Maeve, sitting quietly beside the hospital bed, listening as the most powerful man in the city's shadows opened his heart, felt the final defensive wall inside her tremble softly, because she understood that these words weren't the lies of a scheming man, but the sincere voice of a human being longing to be redeemed. In the weeks after Darius was discharged from the hospital, the silence that seemed to have returned turned out to be only the pause before a greater storm, because the opposing force that had put him in that hospital bed had no intention of stopping. On the contrary, they had scented his hesitation and exhaustion like an animal catching the smell of a wound on its prey. At the head of that force was old Holloway, a man who had long hungered for Darius's territory, and this time he changed his tactics. He no longer relied on direct confrontations that only left both sides damaged, but shifted instead to a far subtler and more dangerous form of attack, tightening his grip around Darius from every direction with the very tools of the lawful world. Cormac brought Darius one piece of bad news after another. That long-standing business partners had suddenly withdrawn all at once after receiving quiet warnings. That transport contracts at the harbor had been broken by paperwork barriers that appeared in strangely perfect timing, that his loans and financial transactions were being examined down to the smallest thread. Worst of all, Holloway had cleverly fed selected information to certain officials and investigators, just enough to trigger an investigation into Darius's business operations, a legal noose slowly tightening around his neck without needing to spill a single drop of blood. Holloway's goal was very clear: to force Darius into a choice, either surrender and hand over his territory in exchange for peace, or keep resisting and watch his entire empire be torn apart piece by piece by both the law and the blows delivered from the shadows. That pressure weighed on Darius in a way physical wounds never had, because now he didn't only have to worry about himself, but also had to think of all the innocent people who might be pulled into this whirlwind. And what kept him awake most through those long nights was Maeve and Briani, because he understood that if Holloway discovered the connection between him and the two sisters, the old man wouldn't hesitate to use them as pieces on the board to put pressure on him. For that reason, he quietly had protection increased around the neighborhood where the sisters lived without letting them know, arranging everything so that Brianni, who still innocently went to school and drew her pictures, would always be absolutely safe within the care of people he trusted. And on the days when Maeve was busy, he discreetly asked Ruth Delacroix, whom the little girl had come to love like a grandmother, to watch over her at home. He did all those things in silence, determined not to let the dark shadow of the world he belonged to fall over the fragile life the two sisters were struggling to build. But he also understood that those protective measures were only temporary, that as long as he still had one foot in the underworld, the people he cared about would remain within the zone of danger, and that harsh truth forced him to face the question he had avoided his entire life. Late one night, Darius sat alone in his familiar office, and before him lay two roads, spread out with merciless clarity. One was the road of the strong man that he had walked for 20 years, the road where he gathered his forces and struck back at Holloway, with all the ruthlessness and strategy he possessed. A war he was entirely capable of winning, but the price would be more blood spilled, more souls caught in sin, and most importantly, it would bind him forever to the very world he now longed to escape. The other was a road he had never dared imagine before, a road full of risk that demanded he give up almost everything he had traded his youth to build, but it was also the only road that could lead him to a truly clean beginning, a life in which he no longer had to live in fear that the people he loved would have to pay for his past. He thought of Salvatore's words from long ago, thought of the lesson Maeve had given him beside the hospital bed about letting go of the things beyond one's control. And he thought of the smile of a 9-year-old girl who believed whales could fly so they would never have to be stranded again. In the stillness of the deep night, the man who had once ruled the darkness through fear finally realized that the real choice didn't lie in whether he had enough strength to defeat Holloway, but in what kind of man he wanted to become for the rest of his life, and whether he had enough courage to trade power for redemption. After many sleepless nights, Darius made the hardest decision of his life, and once he had decided, he pursued it with the same decisiveness that had once helped him climb to the summit of power, except this time he used it to step down. He summoned Cormac, and inside the closed room, he laid out his plan, a plan that stunned even his longtime loyal associate. Darius said he wouldn't choose the path of war with Holloway, because even if he won, he would only chain himself more deeply to the world he wanted to leave behind. Instead, he would approach law enforcement himself, especially the federal prosecutor, who had been pursuing both organizations for many years without ever once reaching the core. He would hand over everything, not only the evidence of Holloway's illegal operations that he had quietly collected through all their years of confrontation, but also the files connected to his own organization, the secrets only he possessed, enough to uproot an entire criminal network that had ruled the darkness of this city for far too long. Cormac went still. He asked Darius whether he understood what he was sacrificing, because doing this meant he would have to give up the entire empire he had built, face the eyes of those who would call him a traitor, and even bear legal consequences himself for the things he had once done. Darius nodded slowly. He said he understood the price better than anyone, that he had no illusion about some gentle escape where he could calmly brush away his sins without losing anything. He said he accepted that he would have to answer before the law for what his hands had done, accepted that the road ahead might bring a sentence, supervision, and a life stripped of most of the privileges he had once taken for granted. But he said it was a worthy price to pay in exchange for something money and power had never been able to buy him, peace in his soul, and a chance for the innocent people around him to live in safety. He admitted to Cormac with raw honesty that this was also the only way he could truly atone for some part of his mistakes, not by denying them or hiding them, but by using the very things he knew to dismantle the machine he had once helped keep running. The process that followed wasn't easy or swift like something in a fairy tale. It dragged on for months, full of tension and danger, with secret meetings, long statements, and nights when Darius had to remain under strict protection, as news of his cooperation began to leak and shook the entire underworld. There were dangerous moments when Holloway's side realized it had been struck back and tried to retaliate, but those efforts were neutralized, partly because of protection from the authorities, and partly because of Darius's own careful calculations, as he understood his enemy better than anyone. Maeve, though she wasn't allowed to know every detail, still felt the weight of what was happening through his exhaustion and his pensive silences each time he stopped by. And once, when she gently asked whether he was certain about the path he was taking, Darius only looked at her and said that for the first time in his life, he was more certain of something than he was afraid of himself. Finally, after so many storms, Holloway's network collapsed completely beneath the weight of undeniable evidence, and along with it, the underworld that Darius had once ruled also fell apart. As for Darius, because of his voluntary cooperation and his crucial role in dismantling an entire criminal operation, he received an agreement that allowed him to keep the legal restaurant chain he cherished, in exchange for strict supervision for a long time, and the permanent renunciation of any involvement in his old activities. It wasn't a complete victory or full absolution, but an atonement filled with loss. He walked out of that world with hands far emptier than when he had entered it, but also lighter than he had ever been. And when everything had finally settled, for the first time in more than 20 years, Darius Kane woke one morning without carrying fear or constant vigilance with him, only a strange stillness and a blank page of life waiting for him to write it again. Spring arrived that year, carrying things that neither Maeve nor Darius would have dared dream of only a few months earlier. And the most precious of them all was that Brianni's heart surgery was finally performed after her health had been carefully prepared, and every cost had been fully covered by the Medical Assistance Fund. That morning, Maeve sat in the waiting room with her hands clasped tightly together, and this time, beside her, there was no longer the loneliness of the old years. There was Darius sitting quietly at her side, there was Ruth, and there was Cormac as well, all of them waiting together in anxious hope. When the surgeon stepped out with a smile on his face and told them that everything had gone well, that Brianni's little heart had now been healed, and that she would be able to live a normal, healthy life like any other child, Maeve broke down sobbing, the tears of all those years of holding herself together, finally allowed to fall in an overflowing happiness. In the days that followed, as Brianni slowly recovered, her cheeks growing rosy again, and the energy of a true 9-year-old child returning to her, all their lives turned onto a new page. Maeve, with the ability she had proven day after day, was trusted with the position of regional manager, overseeing an entire chain of restaurants that had now become completely clean, and she ran them with the very philosophy life had taught her, to care first for the people at the bottom. But she didn't forget the dream of her early 20s, and every evening after Brianni had fallen asleep, she opened her books again and continued pursuing the nursing program she had once been forced to put aside, moving step by step toward the person she had always wanted to become. As for Darius, the man who had once ruled the darkness now poured all his strength into building something with an entirely different meaning. He established a scholarship fund for street teenagers, homeless children, with nowhere to turn, just like the hungry 16-year-old boy he had once been, giving them not only money, but also a chance, a roof, and someone willing to bet on them, exactly as Salvatore Bruno had once done for him. He often said this was the real legacy he wanted to leave behind, not power or fear, but circles of kindness that kept spreading from one person to another. And amid all those changes, something gentle and quiet also began to bloom between Maeve and Darius. Not a loud, rushing kind of love, but the bond of two wounded souls who had found in each other understanding and a place of peace, a feeling built on the foundation of respect and trust that had been nurtured through so many trials. On Darius's birthday, Brianni prepared a special gift she had kept hidden for several days, and when she shyly gave it to him, it was a drawing on a brand new sheet of paper, smooth and dry, no longer blurred like the page from long ago that had melted under the October rain. In that picture were 3 figures standing close together beneath a blue umbrella, a tall man, a red-haired woman, and a tiny girl in the middle holding both their hands, and above them was a careful line of writing that said "Our Home," and this time, not a single raindrop could wash it away. Darius held the picture in his hands for a very long time, the man who had once made an entire city tremble falling silent with emotion. because he understood that the home the boy from long ago had always dreamed of had finally found him, not through power, but through kindness. Their story is a reminder that a person's dignity is never measured by wealth or status, that no one is so completely lost that they can't turn back toward the light, and that sometimes, just one person willing to believe in us, when the whole world has turned away, is enough to change an entire fate and light a circle of love that keeps spreading without end.